Good afternoon. Good afternoon. We are so excited to have you here for this really special event and this amazing, brilliant panel that we are about to have. Before doing too much talking, there's some housekeeping that we need to do and some grounding that we need to do together. There are two interpreters with us today for American Sign Language. So Claire is going to be with us, as well as Suzanne, who will be interpreting. And so you will also be able to, you should be able to see that on your screen. And you can troubleshoot with the live producer if you are having any issues, or put it in the chat with seeing our interpretation. And thank you to Claire and Suzanne for joining us and for helping translate what we are doing so it can be much more accessible to a wider audience. Really appreciate you both. Without further ado, I'd like to move into a land acknowledgement, especially considering that we are based in the Western Hemisphere, that we are based in the colonial nation called the United States. It is important whenever we gather to acknowledge the relationship to land that allows us to gather and be in one place, and both the blessings and the bounty that come from land that enable us to be together. It is also a solidarity practice asked of non-Indigenous people like myself to acknowledge and revisibilize the ongoing genocide against Native and Indigenous peoples, as well as the ongoing colonial relationships that the hundreds of Indigenous nations in this hemisphere have with the colonial nations like the United States, for example. Specifically, Malcolm, I'm on and broadcasting to you today from what is colonially known as Brooklyn, New York, which is part of an archipelago of islands. Brooklyn is a colonial name, it's Dutch. Originally, before the Dutch even knew this area existed, this archipelago of islands at the entrance to Mahicantuk, which is the river that flows both ways, was stewarded and held by the Lenape people. Lenape simply meaning original peoples. And so in the Lenape languages and dialects of this area, there were many traditions that stewarded the biodiversity coming from the Atlantic Ocean running into both what we call today the Delaware River and the Hudson River, which are both two extremely biodiverse places. There were fisheries that were held and stewarded by the Lenape peoples, as well as agricultural forests. The Lenape people held and hold today a diplomatic role across this region of the continent, and are known as peacemakers and the grandfathers of multiple tribes, all the way out to the Anishinaabe at the Great Lakes, or the 5 freshwater seas. Specifically in what's now New York City, the Lenape were holders and gatherers of many Indigenous peoples in this area who came through mostly using trade routes and rivers. And so this area, before New York even existed, was a very strategic importance to the people who came here. And it was for that reason, actually, that the Dutch and the English and the Swedish and others came to this area and decided to exclude and displace the Lenape starting in about the 1700s and a little bit before as well. If I were to go into Manhattan right now, Manhattan being a Lenape word, which means large island on water. If I were to go to the southern tip of Manhattan, there would be an avenue, possibly one of the most famous ones in the United States, at least, Broadway. That is actually a paved over Lenape trail that stretched all the way from the bottom of the island of Manhattan all the way into what's now Mashpee Wampanoag territory, colonially known as Boston. And so those are some of the intercontinental connections that the Lenape held culturally, economically, diplomatically. It's one of the reasons that to this day, New York City continues to be a gathering place for Indigenous peoples. It has one of the largest populations of Indigenous peoples on this continent, North America, or Turtle Island, as lots of Indigenous peoples refer to it. Recently, Black corn, or sesaping, one of the gifts of the Lenape, and one of the specific species of corn that is grown by the Lenape, is being grown on the island of Manhattan for the first time in at least 300 years. And there was also a powwow in 2018, the first held by the nation in about 150 years. So I feel very indebted, both personally and politically, to the legacy of resistance that the Lenape have held on this continent in terms of preserving their cultural legacy, their agricultural practices, their political sovereignty. And politically, I feel committed constantly to, in the future, making sure that I am contributing in all of my work to ending the colonial relationship that the Lenape and many other nations have to the United States government, to Canada, to Mexico, and the list goes on. And so I end this section of Land Acknowledgement with a quotation from a poem by Joy Harjo, who is the Poet Laureate of the United States as of this moment, the first Native woman to be a Poet Laureate of the United States. She's an enrolled member of the Muskogee Creek Nation in the southeast of Turtle Island. And she writes, "We are still America. We know the rumors of our demise. We spit them out. They die soon." In so many ways, that is the spirit of what inspires this panel, the understanding that there are other worlds and other ways of understanding how we can relate to peoples who are different from us, how we can have solidarity with one another. And so the past of the Lenape definitely calls us to understand or calls us to a different universe of diplomacy in which people are equal with one another and collaborating for a better life on the land they share. The present of the Lenape calls us to acknowledge that there are other nations who occupy this land and who have colonial arrangements with the government of the United States and other states, other nations. The future of the Lenape demands that we talk about US exceptionalism, that we bring US imperialism into focus, so that we can actually do the work of undoing the harms of settler colonialism on this continent. And so with that said, we're gonna move forward to talk a little bit about Race Forward. Race Forward is the sort of convener and holder of this webinar panel. Race Forward was founded in the early 1980s out of the idea that we can talk about race and win, that we can build multiracial solidarity for broad-based issues that transform society to have positive, sustainable, systemic impacts on communities of color, on Indigenous communities, et cetera. And so some of the holistic ways that Race Forward chooses to do that are through its programming. Like, for example, Color Lines, an online newsletter where you can read everyday current events through the lenses of racism, racial justice, and race. There is the biennial conference Facing Race, which will be happening next fall, which we can all really look forward to, where thousands of people gather to talk about, to strategize, to learn about, to really share and build community around racial justice, as well as Mass Freedom, a program that brings together abolitionist organizers working to end all kinds of mass criminalization and the mass incarceration that we face in a crisis that is incarcerating many people for the crime of existing, either in poverty or through migration. So with that said, I'm going to pass it to Shweta to introduce herself. I'm going to introduce myself, and then we'll move forward with a little recap of what we did last time we gathered. All right, off to you, Shweta.
Yeah, what a meaningful land acknowledgement, and I hope you see what folks are already writing in the chat. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shweta Murthy. My gender pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I am calling from I occupy the lands of Ojibwe, Odawa, and Potawatomi nations, also known as Chicago. I'm the research director here at Race Forward, and I've had the unique pleasure of collaborating with Malcolm on this US exceptionalism work since the time we seeded it at the previous facing race of 2020. And I'm just so excited to gather this group of speakers together to create what is unfortunately a pretty rare space to talk about US imperialism and US exceptionalism. I come here as a migrant from India and got really politicized on US imperialism as South Asia being a site of US imperialist expansion and wars during what is called as the Cold War here in the United States, moving onwards to the wars in Afghanistan and so on. And I also saw that in line with sort of an Indian exceptionalism and the Indian hegemonic expansion in the lands of Kashmir and the northeast of India, and have just been really excited to do this work with Malcolm on US exceptionalism. Handing it back to you, Malcolm, to make your introduction.
Thank you, Shweta. It absolutely has been a pleasure and unfortunately too unique, as you were saying earlier. My name is Malcolm Shanks. I use they, them pronouns. I am an educator or researcher. I am based in Lenape, specifically Canarsie and Rockaway Lenape lands. But I was born and raised in Piscataway and Ocochtonk lands, which is colonially known as Washington, D.C. And I will always rep that very hard. I have a 202 number and a DC ID to this day. It is a complicated relationship being from what's called the nation's capital. I grew up in one of the few neighborhoods that was named after the indigenous peoples of that area. It's called Anacostia now. And it is no longer really associated with indigenous people. It is mostly associated with the historically Black community that's been there and also poverty. And so growing up Black and poor in a place that is associated with Black poverty, in a city that claims to be one of the wealthiest and most powerful on earth, meant that I was constantly hearing about that wealth and power while experiencing and witnessing disempowerment and degradation, disempowerment and lack, you know? And so that caused a major contradiction in my understanding of what the United States claims to be, but also in comparison with what its reality is in the very shadow of some of the monuments and other, we could say, temples to what people call the greatness of the United States. I was lucky to be in a community where so many of the questions that I asked about the patterns that I saw in the world were answered truthfully. And the truth that many told me was that the patterns that I saw were related to white supremacy as a system. Were related to the ordering of our world to concentrate more and more resources in the hands of fewer and fewer white people over time. And so that launched me into an activist career that has spanned, at this point, a couple of decades, I'm blessed to say. And so, yeah, there are lessons that I've drawn from that, but mostly I'm excited for you to hear from others today. So I'm gonna move forward to talk a little bit about what inspires us to gather today for you all to witness what we're going to say to one another and to witness this conversation. A few questions really animated when Shweta and I first did this as a webinar in 2020. One is, why is the United States allowed to posture as a, quote, leader of the free world while occupying stolen land. The second is, why does mainstream politics in the United States elevate civil rights here domestically and human rights everywhere else? What accounts for that distinction? And third, why do US-based racial justice movements have so little to say about the US as an empire? We moved into seeing that US exceptionalism was actually one of the central ideas that created some of the distractions, cognitive dissonances, and contradictions that exist between how the United States projects itself, how it advertises itself, and what people experience as the impacts of the United States, both outside the United States and here. And so we pulled from the dictionary, because people love dictionary definitions, to say that the US exceptionalism in one way is the belief that the United States differs qualitatively from other developed nations because of its national credo, historical evolution, or distinctive political and religious institutions. We also added to that we think it's an ideology or a system of beliefs. And it's a concrete political structure as well that exempts the United States from the laws or norms that govern other countries. We also added that we think it's a belief that the United States' military and economic position entitles the country to moral and political leadership globally. And I'm sure these are not the only things that we can add to, that we can have as part of this conversation. That's part of what our panelists will be engaging here. Lastly, we isolated some dynamics of US exceptionalism and some common patterns that we wanted to lift up so that we could help people decode them in a more fluent way and also fight against them and dismantle them. So one is that manifest destiny, this idea that the United States is supposed to occupy indigenous land, the former land of other nation states on this continent like Mexico, that it is engaged in a continental imperialist project, we could say. This manifest destiny thinking celebrates breaking treaties with indigenous nations and celebrates the imperialist warfare necessary to achieve what we now acknowledge as the continental borders of the United States, but it also extends into the Pacific, the Caribbean, and all over the world these days. Secondly, we talked about historical amnesia and the willful ignorance that enables the claim of innocence, i.e., one can selectively choose from one's history such that it seems that one is always has the best interest of the globe in mind, as opposed to selfish interests that might be colonial, material, racist, or imperialist. And then third, that there is a necessary evil rhetoric from the political establishment of the United States that normalizes the violence, that when accountability and honesty is actually achieved, that the discourse becomes one of a mistake or a necessary evil required for the mission, ultimately, of the United States to continue flowing as planned, one that is assumed to be altruistic and positive in impact. So these are the panelists who we have invited to add so much more and expand some of the ideas, challenge some of the ideas, and really, hopefully, most of all, concretize and bring down to earth some of the impacts and experiences of US exceptionalism that we have in our daily work, in our lives, in our organizing, and in our solidarity. So I'm going to introduce them as they write about themselves on paper, and then we're going to go to the more important section where they talk about who they are. Starting with Ola Osaze. Ola Osaze is a trans-masculine queer of Edo and Yoruba descent who was born in Port Harcourt River State and now resides in Houston, Texas. Ola is the co-director for the Black LGBTQ+ Migrant Project and has been a community organizer for many years, including working with Transgender Law Center, the Audre Lorde Project, Uhuru Wazobia, one of the first LGBT groups for African immigrants in the US, Queers for Economic Justice, and Sylvia Rivera Law Project. Ola is a 2015 Voices of Our Nation Arts Workshop Fellow and has writings published in Apogee, Cuisine, Black Looks, and the anthologies Black Futures and Queer Africa too. Thanks so much for being with us, Ola. Dr. Maha Hilal is a researcher and writer on institutionalized Islamophobia and author of the forthcoming book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim: Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. Her writings have appeared in Vox, Al Jazeera, Middle East Eye, Newsweek, Business Insider, and Truth Out. She is the co-director of Justice for Muslims Collective, where she focuses on political consciousness and narrative shifting programming. Dr. Hilal earned her doctorate in May 2014 from the Department of Justice, Law, and Society at American University in Washington, D.C. The title of her dissertation is Too Damn Muslim to Be Trusted: The War on Terror and the Muslim American Response. She received her master's degree in counseling and her bachelor's degree in sociology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Hilal. Nakaya Flote is a postdoctoral fellow with the Department of Latino Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She has worked on issues of border outsourcing in Mexico, mainly providing aid to trans queer migrants traveling on the migrant route or at the US-Mexico border. She is the co-founder of Diversidad Sin Fronteras, now Un Mundo Sin Fronteras, a collective based out of Austin, Texas. Thank you so much for being here, Nakai. And last but not least, we have Johanna Fernandez. Johanna Fernandez is Associate Professor of History at Baruch College of the City University of New York and author of The Young Lords of Radical History, recipient in 2021 of the New York Society Library's New York City Book Award and 3 Organization of American Historians Awards: the prestigious Frederick Jackson Turner Award for Best Book and Best First Book in History, the Liberty Legacy Foundation Award for Best Book on Civil Rights, and the Merle Corti Award for Best Social History. This book is also the recipient of the 2021 American Book Award given by the Before Columbus Foundation. Dr. Fernandez's 2014 Freedom of Information lawsuit against the NYPD led to the recovery of the lost handshoe files, the largest repository of police surveillance records in the country, namely over 1 million surveillance records of New Yorkers compiled by the NYPD between 1954 and 1972, including those of Malcolm X. He's also the host of the morning show, A New Day at 99.5 FM in New York on Pacifica's WBAI on Fridays from 7 to 8 a.m. I really recommend that show. Thank you for being with us, Dr. Fernandez. I am so excited. As you all can see, we have some major powerhouses with us in terms of thinking, organizing, and experience. And so now we're going to move to a much more colloquial way that I like to be introduced to people where I come from. So we're going to ask Ola first. Who are you and who are your people?
Thank you, Malcolm. And hello, everyone. Bawoni, as they say in my language, which basically means what's up, how are you?
Bawoni.
And that's Yoruba. My name is Ola Osaze. I am a queer and trans masked Nigerian migrant living here in the US. And I live just outside of Houston, Texas. And I am the co-director of the Black LGBTQ Migrant Project, or BLMP. So, where I'm from, of course, I'm from Nigeria. More specifically, I'm from Oyo State, Edo State, basically the west and southwest portion of Nigeria. And my people are, of course, Nigerians, African people. My people are also all Black LGBTQIA plus folks, folks who, are migrants or immigrants, folks who envision a world beyond geographic borders and want to fight for that world. My people are Black writers, folks who get inspiration and nourishment from the legacy of Audre Lorde and James Baldwin and Funmilayo Kuti and Buchi Emecheta. These are also my people. My people are artists and Afrobeat obsessed folks as well. So yeah, I'll pause there and kick it back to you, Malcolm. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Ola, for joining us. Ishun. So next we have Dr. Maha Hilal. So Dr. Hilal, who are you and who are your people?
Well, thank you, Malcolm, for the question, and thank you to Race Forward for organizing this incredible event. You know, I often think about this question, and it's sometimes hard in terms of like thinking about the hierarchy, like what identities do you kind of resonate more with? So my family's Egyptian, and we're immigrants. My parents immigrated to the United States. And I'd say my people are Muslims, Arabs, Africans, immigrants, other marginalized communities. And, you know, I think what's important actually for me to highlight is that, you know, there's a lot of anti-Blackness in the Arab world, or what is considered the Arab world. So growing up, you know, I was considered just Arab, or I was thought to just see myself as just Arab, although Egypt is right in the continent of Africa. And so, you know, growing up and just thinking about what does that mean, and how do I kind of bring those two identities together, something that, you know, I've thought a lot about in recent years, and really want to bring it to my sense of identity, and also just like, who are my people, right? My people are Africans. And in general, my people are everyone who's working for social justice, collective liberation, and who's just trying to make this world a better place for all communities, especially the marginalized communities, whether in the US or abroad.
Thank you, Dr. Hilal. Thank you for being here. Let's go next to Nakai. Yeah, who are you and who are your people, Nakai?
Hi, hello. My name is Nakai Flot. So Shiei Nakai Nishle, Nakai Nishle, Kolka Hende Bashishin, Akot Eko, and then Atla Nishle. So hello everyone, good afternoon. My name is Nakai Flot. I just introduced my people actually. I am Kolka Hende, that's my clan in Nakaye. I am Lipan Inde or Lipan Apache and Hulime. Basically are two native peoples here in Texas, in the Chihuahuan desert, in the Texas-Mexico border. So that's my people. We've been at the current day Texas-Mexico border for quite a while, for well, at least based on Spanish documentation, at least for 100 years. And we've been at the borders basically in my lifetime, right? Not my ancestors' lifetime, but my lifetime. I've seen the changes in the infrastructure of border enforcement and the militarization of the border, even in my own lifetime. So I think that I am here mostly to share that kind of perspective of an indigenous person from the US-Mexico border and what it means when your homeland is bifurcated. What does it mean to both provide or think of border imperialism, as I call it, the idea of border outsourcing or externalization, how that affects not just refugee people. And obviously we have to be in solidarity with refugee people. That's what this work is about, but also in solidarity with the local people that are there that don't necessarily use the border as a place of crossing, but as a place of living. And that's gonna be like sort of, I'll just leave it at that. And I have a PhD from Harvard University, and I am a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Texas at Austin. Thank you.
Thank you, Nakai. Thank you so much for being with us. And thank all of you so far as well for bringing your people here and sharing them with us. I think that'll be also an appropriate grounding as we move into this conversation. So last but not least, once again, we have Johanna Fernandez. Thank you for joining us. Please, who are you and who are your people?
We do this a million times and we still don't get it right. Thank you, Malcolm, for the invitation, and thank you to Race Forward for putting on this important teach-in. It's the work we need to do in this period, and I imagine that it took a lot of herding cats, including myself, to put the show on the road. And what an incredible question. First of all, who am I? I'm Black. My parents are immigrants from the Dominican Republic. I'm from the BX, from the Boogie Down, born and bred. I'm the child of migration, with all of the complexities that entails, being betwixt and between two cultures, helping my parents adapt to their settlement, being a translator at a way too young age for my own good psychologically. And who are my peoples? That's such a complex question. My peoples are oppressed people all over the world. My peoples are Haitians who are oppressed by people in the Dominican Republic, mostly its ruling class. My peoples are revolutionaries, people who have courage and who won't stop until they find liberation. But my peoples are not all oppressed people and not all Black people or all Dominicans or all Latinx people, because there are classes among our peoples. And ethnicity, race, gender, sexuality doesn't necessarily put you on the right side of history. So my peoples are the people I organize with. These are people who stand on principle and not random loyalty. My peoples are the folks with whom I organize, and organizing requires building trust, right? That's the elementary, primary building block of changing the world. We don't do that alone. We do that in the collective. And we need to trust each other, what we believe in, what we stand for, and what we won't allow to happen in order to fight for a new world.
Okay, I'm already so excited to hear so much more. Okay, so I'm going to pass it to Shweta so that we can move on from here. Thank you so much. Appreciate y'all.
Thanks, Malcolm. Yeah, and what a great question and what a great set of responses. So I'm going to be moderating this discussion for the next hour or so. So the first question is for all speakers, and maybe we can keep on going in the order that you introduced yourself. So the first question is, in July's webinar that Malcolm and I did, we defined US exceptionalism generally as a complex of ideas and practices that place the United States as exempt from, and in some cases, superior to international accountability and historical realities. Would you agree with that explanation of US exceptionalism? And which exceptions or exemptions have been most present or concrete in your personal and political life? So Ola, maybe we can start with you again and then pass the mic to Maha, to Nakai, and then to Johanna.
And I'm very okay with switching the order of this as well. But this is such a deep and layered question, and it just brings so many examples to me, to my mind. You know, just even starting with where I was born. You know, Malcolm read the bio, and I was born in Port Harcourt, River State, which is known as the Delta part of Nigeria. And I think some folks may be familiar with some of the Delta people's struggles. You know, we have many ethnicities, many ethnicities within that portion of the country, and it's the southern portion of Nigeria. And it's the portion that's closest to the Atlantic Ocean. And it's also the part of the country in which the main source of revenue for Nigeria is oil. And so the Delta area is where the oil drilling is happening. So you can imagine the environmental devastation that's happened there for many, many years, that has, you know, spurred, a people's movement to not just focused on the Nigerian government, also focused on US-based corporations like ExxonMobil, right? And so I think about the devastation that has happened to many parts of the physical devastation, the environmental injustice has happened to many parts of Nigeria, my homeland, and how that has, really drastically hindered the quality of life for many folks, and how I want to lay the blame of that right at the foot of the United States. So that is one clear example for me in terms of this question. I also think about Christian fundamentalism and the rise in the born again movement in Nigeria, and how that was spurred, fueled by the Christian fundamentalism here in the US. And then the impacts of that in Nigeria, just from my own personal experience as a queer and trans person, is the criminalization of LGBTQ folks. We have a law in the books now. Granted, the law, the anti-LGBTQ law was grandfathered from, our colonial, masters like the British. However, the revival of that penal code was fueled by, Christian fundamentalist movements here in the US, right? And so that means that my folks are criminalized. Folks are either facing 14-year jail term or just straight up violence on a daily basis. And many folks have experienced this, and many of us have been forced to leave. Here I am in the US, and many of the folks who are members of my organization are folks who are asylum seekers or asylees who have had to leave because of the way in which Christian fundamentalist movements here in the US influence culture and laws that lead to us being displaced. So that's another example. I think about things like AFRICOM, right, which is the US military outpost all over the continent, and how that is fueling civil wars, fueling wars between countries, fueling various types of criminalization of queers, of women, of political dissidents, of folks with disability. I mean, you name it. And then how that is also, again, influencing the environmental injustice and making our homelands on the African continent, for example, unlivable. I think about the US supply of weapons and what that is doing for all kinds of wars and clashes, in Black majority nations, right? I think about Haiti. Oh my God. I think about Haiti and what happened in Del Rio a couple of weeks ago in terms of the thousands of Haitian migrants that, many of them from Mexico who had been stranded, at the border for a long time, and thousands of folks being kind of stranded under this bridge in Del Rio. And, the images that we saw of how they were treated by mostly white customs and border officers, by ICE. And then, you place that reality against the backdrop of the history of Haiti in terms of the first Black republic to throw out the shackles of slavery, and how Haiti has been paying for that audacity to be free for many, many years, and how the US has toppled governments, has made Haiti the way it is now in a lot of ways in terms of the crumbling political and economic infrastructure, and then the need for many people to leave because they have no choice. So there's so many examples of this. I think about Honduras and the fight of the Garifuna, the fight of the Garifuna folks in Honduras in terms of hanging onto their land and their livelihood and their culture, and how the US focused, or the US-led tourist industry is leading the development and the theft and development of those lands of Garifuna, Black and Indigenous people in Honduras. And how that is also forcing migration, as well as creating all kinds of crises and criminalizing people and so forth. So I could go on and on about the ways in which this question, relates to my personal life, to the lives of and experiences of my community, and just broadly. But I just wanted to offer those examples to illustrate, illustrate my response to that question, and I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ola. And hopefully with the continuing conversation, you see other things that you weren't able to mention to share being shared by your fellow panelists and to be able to go deeper. And so with that, I would love to invite Maha to answer this question.
Yeah, so this is an interesting question. And obviously, as someone who has researched and written extensively on the war on terror, American exceptionalism is very much at the root of it. So when I think about the definition that you all have provided, I think it's a great definition. I think it frames some of the key problems with the ways that the United States shows up in the world. But I think what we need to think about in addition to that is, what is American exceptionalism rooted in, right? So American exceptionalism is rooted in this idea that the United States is sort of the highest form of civilization, right? That all other countries in the world should aspire to be like the United States. That the United States is somehow supported by, in its work, in its mission, by God, right? This is a religious, the United States has a religious grounding from which to claim its exception. Additionally, there's the idea that's very apparent and obvious throughout US history that the American system of government is superior, right? If you want to look at a model for governance in the world, everyone should therefore look to the United States because it is superior. And the United States, because of that, this idea that the United States is superior, right? And we have this democracy that is, you know, so just like, it's so strong and it's so rooted that we can then go to other countries on the basis of promoting democracy there, because ours is the model of what democracy actually looks like. And, you know, the interesting thing is US exceptionalism, again, has been part of US history forever. But in the context of the war on terror, when you listen to, for example, one of the speeches that Bush first gave on September 20th, 2001, which was about 9 days right after the 9/11 attacks, he talks about how Americans have known wars. He says Americans have known wars since for the past 136 years, but it's always been on foreign soil. And the difference this time is that the United States was attacked. And the way that American exceptionalism relates here is that it's such a surprise. It's positioned as a surprise. How could this happen to the greatest country in the world, right? And the answer is because the terrorists, the quote terrorists, right, hate us for our freedoms and our democracy, etc., right? It's not because the United States has done anything in the past, has not intervened in countries abroad to cause dysfunction, to cause destruction. It's none of that, because the United States, if it inflicts violence onto other countries and communities, it is legitimized, right? And that's the sort of de facto assumption. And I think, you know, just generally, when you look at the ways in which violence of the United States government has been talked about by the United States government in the context of the war on terror, it's always that US violence is justified. So for example, when the Abu Ghraib, I hate the word scandal, but when the Abu Ghraib photos emerged and the United States was being challenged either by citizens in their own country or citizens abroad, you know, and Rumsfeld was addressing what happened. He was addressing the accusations. His response was, quote, "Does it rank up there with chopping someone's head off on television? It doesn't." So in other words, and related back to the idea that the United States is exempt, nothing the United States can do could ever conceivably compare to the violence that others cause. And that has been a very consistent theme in the global war on terror. And it's been very extremely problematic, right? Because the United States has allowed itself to go into countries left and right, not just the countries that it has officially launched war on, but also the countries, right? Like Somalia, where there's drone strikes all the time, right? and just other countries where there is some sort of warfare going on, regardless of whether or not it's referred to as or framed as or acknowledged as war. So I think, there's obviously a lot to say about US exceptionalism. And maybe, the last example I'll give is that, the Biden administration in September just submitted their 6th periodic report to the Committee Against Torture. And in one part of their report, they say, quote, "For reasons of privacy, the United States is not in a position to disclose the information sought with regard to Central Intelligence Agency detained persons rendered to other countries." Right? I mean, the United States can claim this is about state secrets and others will want to harm us if they know the information. But at the end of the day, this is about impunity and a lack of accountability on the US government's part for the harm, again, that it has inflicted on communities domestically and abroad, and taking absolutely no responsibility for it. Because what's always clear to the US government is that what happened to the United States on 9/11 trumped everything that happened thereafter in terms of the violence it caused compared to the violence that was caused to it. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Maha. Yeah, hearing so many strands of like what constitutes legitimate violence and illegitimate violence, and seeing sort of strands of sort of political prisoners and the denial or the taking of political prisoners. And I know Johanna has some depth of expertise in that, and would love to hear from Johanna about that as well. But yeah, I want to pass the mic to Nakai.
Hello. Well, thank you for this question, Malcolm, and all the organizers. When this question was sent to me, I wasn't sure how to answer it because I feel like I had to break it down a little bit. So I'm gonna just give you a little bit of my process of thinking of how I broke down that question so that I could actually provide an example that made sense. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that when we think of US exceptionalism, we also have to think about other aspects, and I list them here. It's 3 aspects that I think that are important when we think about like the modern conception of US exceptionalism, because obviously we have a historical idea of what that means. But right now in the formation of the modern state, there are particularities to it, or at least in my case, or the example that I would provide. On the one hand, you have sovereign power, right? The idea that the sovereign state has the right to control its territory, and not just its territory, but other countries' territories, as I would provide an example through the outsourcing of military intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. The second point that I think is important that it was sort of touched upon here is the deployment of state security in time and space. And by that, I mean, this idea of who gets to be secure and who doesn't get to be secure, and what's in security for whom, right? The question of who are we securing and what are the strategies that we is taking to secure this particular kind of group. So I think that's also part of US exceptionalism, because you have to distinguish, and this leads us to our third one, which is the distinguish of human difference, right? Usually in the social sciences, when you talk about sovereignty and the modern state, usually Western white philosophers tend to focus a lot, tend to flatten the human experience, tend to say that there's a relationship between the state and the human. But rather, what I think that we need to be talking about is back to the root of where US exceptionalism comes from. And it's through what you mentioned, manifest destiny, white supremacy, right? The enslavement of thousands of people and the stolen labor, basically. So when we think about US exceptionalism, we also have to think about who gets to win and who gets to lose. And I think that that's also important how when we frame questions of who gets to be exceptional or exempt and who doesn't. So I think it also has to be focused on the individual. And in the example that I would provide is I'm gonna just provide one example, which is what I've been doing for research for the past 5 years. And since 2015, I began to research the implementation of a program called the Southern Border Plan. And this program was implemented during the Obama administration, followed by 2 massive waves of people, one of Central Americans arriving in 2014 and one of Haitians arriving to the US-Mexico border, to the Tijuana-Mexico border in 2015. It's important to mention that it was during this massive arrival of Haitians in the US-Mexico border in 2015 that the metering system was implemented. It's very important to add Haitians into this part of historical making of the border because they have been migrating there for many decades, and oftentimes it doesn't get framed that way. But it was because of Haitians that the United States responded saying, okay, we're gonna implement a metering system whereby asylum seekers have to wait a number in order to present to seek asylum, right? So, but the exempt, that's not the exempt I wanted to provide. That's kind of just a caveat. The exempt I wanted to provide is outsourcing of border security from the United States to Mexico, right? The United States gets to be exempt in terms of respecting or protecting Mexico's, or not even Mexico's, but also indigenous people's autonomy and sovereignty in these territories. We have to remember that the implementation of the Southern Border Plan, which was in which the United States gave intelligence money to Mexico to detain Central Americans and Haitians, it didn't just transform the landscape of security, like adding checkpoint infrastructure, adding more patrols, but it also shaped the ways in which Mexicans thought of their citizenship. And their citizenship was sort of thought about in relation to the United States, right? In the United States citizenship. And it allows for further sort of forms of exemptions, right? Where many local Mexican citizens would often rob or exploit migrants that are coming by with no consequences. And obviously the state does these practices as well. So I think that I'm gonna keep it at that, and the idea of outsourcing, or the idea of one state telling another state what to do in regards to immigration and border enforcement, which is something relatively new that we often think that is something that has existed for a long time, but it hasn't. This is relatively new, but once it becomes part of the law, people fetishize the law, and people think that this law has existed for many years. And this is the way many Mexicans say that. Mexicans, as kind of echoing the voices of Americans saying, they must follow the law. They must follow the law. They must follow Mexican law. But what is Mexican law? And why is Mexican law often contradicting itself in relationship to the United States and the changes in immigration at the US-Mexico border? So that's the example that I would provide for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Nakai, for also providing that transparency and vulnerability about your approach to the question. Johanna?
Thank you. Yeah, I also was stumped in thinking through how to answer this question. And I just want to respond quickly to what has been said, since Haitians are being mentioned, that Haitians are disproportionately represented in the border prisons today. In many ways, Black migrants are left out of the story, but they figure prominently in this border crisis created by US empire. I also want to underscore the definition of American exceptionalism that Dr. Maha outlined. And once again, it's the inherent superiority of the US. That's what usually is thought of when we talk about US exceptionalism. It's inherent superiority, but also the special conditions that brought that superiority into being in the continent. And of course, the supposed inherently democratic proclivity of American society. And essentially, it's one of the origin stories of the United States. And all origin stories are explained through references to human nature or divine grace, right? And it's interesting that during the War on Terror, the United States had a lot to say about the fundamentalism of the lands it was invading. But if you look at American history, it is essentially driven by religious fundamentalism. And in fact, in the early 20th century, there is a movement of Americans that we teach and we study, known as the fundamentalist movement, that attempted to put the laws and culture of American society in line with teachings of the Bible that were very strict. So, so next time the United States calls anyone a fundamentalist, we just need to put a mirror to the history and to the face of the United States. I'll say this. It's important to challenge this notion of US exceptionalism with the reality. Like, all bullies and dictators and hegemons are kind of like psychopaths. They run around like the best, kindest, most benevolent people in the world. But behind closed doors, they're predators. And they rely on this gaslighting. They rely on a denial of reality. So what we need to do is at every turn confront the psychopath and the hegemon with the reality of its predations. So the early colonists here in North America literally made gun ownership a mandate for all emerging citizens, European citizens. Why? Because the colonists, the European colonists, the British colonists, were invading indigenous lands. And what we don't ever hear is that indigenous people fought back against the violent displacement of their families and their communities from their lands. That's the important thing, that the indigenous people fought back. And so the colonists had to figure out how to put down that rebellion and insurrection. And so the Second Amendment of the United States is not a product of the Constitution. It was actually born out of the necessities of this violent displacement of indigenous people from their lands and indigenous people who were fighting back. It was also needed because the enslaved Africans that were brought here were also engaged in rebellion. So those enslaved people who were rebelling against their enslavement had to be put down. And this is where police come in. So this is what happens at birth in this country. We're talking about one of only 3 societies in the world that are slave societies. That's Brazil, the Caribbean, and the United States. These are what are known as slave societies. That is, societies whose economic organization depends exclusively on enslaved labor. Other societies of antiquity, and even societies in North America, indigenous societies, were societies with slaves. That meant that slaves were part of the society, but they were not integral to the social and economic organization of those societies. And on that foundation, we see the rise of capitalism. So the production of cash crops of cotton, indigo, rice, tobacco, sugar, these were the first mass-produced goods that were distributed globally. And on this economic foundation is that we see the rise of American capitalism, British capitalism as well. So when we hear conversations about American exceptionalism, we need to very clearly expose the terrain of blood and violence upon which this society emerges, which then necessitates the dehumanization of those it enslaves and displaces from their lands, right? Their criminalization and their dehumanization through race ideology. I could go on a little more, but maybe there's no time.
Or maybe there's another question to go into it deeper. Thanks, Johanna. So the next question is for Maha and Johanna. What do you see as the role of the media in upholding US exceptionalism? And what examples of media have you seen that challenge the status quo of US exceptionalism or try to repair the harm done? And there's somebody who will post that question in the chat for everyone to read. So Maha, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. So, there's obviously many, many examples that we can point to in terms of the media upholding US exceptionalism. I think that's a pretty much consistent theme across the board, especially when it comes to national security, warfare, and militarism, surveillance, et cetera, anything that's sort of within the purview, I think, of national security especially. So one of the examples I'd like to think about is in August, when 13 service members were killed in an attack in Afghanistan. And despite the fact that there was also 200 Afghan civilians who were killed, the media kept consistently saying 13 service members and either something like and many others, sometimes and Afghan civilians. But the idea was that most of the time, there wasn't a numerical value attached to the number of Afghans who had lost their lives. So what does that mean, right? And what does that suggest, right? It suggests, of course, that American lives are inherently more valuable than the lives of Afghans who've been killed. And it also erases the context in which this happened. The context being, of course, the US's invasion and continued occupation in Afghanistan. That's just one example, but it really shows how American lives are prioritized and are deemed superior when it comes to something as simple as numbers. How many people died in the American context and how many people died in Afghanistan, right? So I think that that's been a really big problem. In addition, there was a speech I think that Biden gave on August 31st about withdrawing US forces from Afghanistan. And, he kept talking about the airlifting of Afghans out of the country. And he kept repeating that Afghans, that they took 100,000 Afghans, they evacuated 100,000 Afghans from the country, which was the largest airlift in US history. Of course, when it came to the media, there was no reflection on exactly why the United States would be doing that, right? Why is the United States responsible for evacuating Afghans from Afghanistan? Was it because, for example, the secret that everyone knows, the United States has caused death and destruction for the last 2 decades in Afghanistan and even before 2001? Absolutely not. So there's really no interrogation about why this was happening. So it was positioned and painted as another example of US benevolence, right? Our exceptionalism is rooted also in our benevolence. We are exceptionally generous people. The US is an exceptionally generous country, right? Then another example that did the rounds and was very problematic is I think back in May or maybe April, when Ilhan Omar said, quote, "We have unthinkable atrocities committed by the US, Hamas, Israel, Afghanistan, and the Taliban. We must have the same level of accountability and justice for all victims of crime against humanity." So what happened after this? The media was all over, as was the government, the idea that Ilhan Omar, Representative Omar, could possibly be saying that the two forms of violence were equivalent. How could that be? How could you equate the legitimized, justified violence of the state to Afghanistan, which is called sort of a failed country, right? And non-state actors. How could you do that, right? And there wasn't really the question of what does moral exclusion, moral equivalence actually mean, right? So, you know, there was obviously a lot of resistance in the government. Ilhan Omar was receiving death threats. Of course, that was fairly minimized in the media, right? Because we never want to talk about the consequences of these kind of situations, these condemnations by government officials, by media, on people of color. And the Democratic Party themselves, a couple of representatives from the Democratic Party really went in on her and talked about how this was just, you know, a horrible argument. It's offensive, it's misguided, etc. Now, of course, there was some pushback, but generally the pushback was that's not what she was saying. She was not saying that the violence of Israel and the United States is equivalent to the violence of Afghanistan and the Taliban, right? That's one way of responding. However, what that way of responding does is, in fact, to give legitimacy to the assumptions on which moral equivalence is based. Another approach, there was an article, of course, in The Intercept, which sought to really talk about, right, what is the origins of that term, moral equivalence? And the origins comes from the Reagan administration. And the idea of the use of that term was to say that, you know, whatever violence we commit, no matter how horrific, how barbaric and destructive, cannot be compared to, it is inconceivable, right, in fact, to compare it to the violence of these other people that is clearly more violent, right? And when we really interrogate this topic, right, if you are someone living in Afghanistan, for example, and your whole entire family gets killed by a drone, obviously there's going to be the larger dynamics at play. But is it going to bother you less that the United States killed them by drones, or that they were killed by drones by non-state actors? Is the fact that they were killed, right? That's the problem, not necessarily about who is responsible for their murders. So the last thing I'll say is, you know, I wrote an op-ed in Al Jazeera about this question of moral equivalence. And to me, the important part to push back on was the idea of why do we take for granted and as an accepted assumption that there's something inherently worse about non-state actor violence from state violence? What actually makes them morally unequivocal, right? And there's ways to measure this, right? Are they different in the number of people that are killed, right? Are they different in the infrastructure of the country that's damaged and destroyed? What makes them different qualitatively and quantitatively? And in many cases, in fact, in most cases, if we're talking about moral equivalence, when it comes to the US's violence and non-state actor violence, the United States is by far more destructive and harmful than non-state actor violence has been. To accept the idea that this is not the case, I think really has to be called out. And I think when we talk about how to push back on these media narratives, right, what it's about is, in fact, rejecting the dominant narrative, not responding to it in a way that legitimizes its core assumptions. And that continues to happen over and over and over again, right? The media is just responsible for, quote, being objective and reporting. And we know objectivity is just, you know, I'm sorry, bullshit. And it really comes from a sort of a white lens, right? Where white people are considered to be objective and neutral, and everyone else has an obviously biased perspective. So I think I'll leave it at that. But it is to say that this is a very big problem. And actually, the last thing I'll say is when the 10 Afghan civilians were killed in the last couple of months, and the United States, the Biden administration said it was a tragic mistake, right? They're allowed to say it was a tragic mistake, even though we know that 10 civilians being murdered by the US government is hardly the biggest mistake they have made, right? And it's not even a mistake, right? If you cared about the people in the country that you were intervening in, this would have never happened. It wouldn't have been a mistake. But the media allows for the narrative that really is contrary and false in terms of what the context actually suggests. So I will stop there.
All right, so I think what's important to enter into dialogue with Dr. Maha, what's important to underscore, which the media never entertains, and oftentimes we don't either, is that there is a difference between the violence of the oppressor and the violence of the oppressed who are engaged in a project of self-defense. So that means that Palestinians have the right, by any means necessary, to defend themselves against the predations and structural violence rained upon them by a settler colonial state like Israel. That means that you have to make a decision about whether you are going to stand with the slave rebellions that often killed the slave masters, right? You have to make a decision about whether or not you're going to stand with Native Americans who warred against settlers in the 19th century, who were reoccupying their lands for the 5th or 6th time since the colonial project began. There is this thing that's actually defended in the UN, not exactly a radical institution, which says that if you are invaded or warred upon, you have the right to defend yourself by any means necessary. Boom. So there is no moral equivalency when it comes to the predation and war and violence of empire in the Middle East, in Latin America, in the Caribbean, in Africa. So that's really the issue that is skirted and never really discussed. Because if you discuss the violence of the oppressor versus the violence of the oppressed, who are forced to act in self-defense, then you have to admit that American exceptionalism is in fact organized around predatory violence. That's not really what I wanted to talk about, but I think that we often miss that there are two kinds of violences, and we defend violence in self-defense. So when a woman kills her partner who has, for the 18th time, beat her bloody, we actually stand with the woman who is defending herself against the violence of her oppressor. And the violence of that oppressor is not violence that exists in that moment. It is actually backed up by power and hundreds of years of cultural acceptance and normalization. So the question was to offer an example of how the media really sides with empire and props up the ideology and logic of empire. And one example that comes to mind was the moment when the United States invaded Iraq in the aftermath of 9/11. And it took the United States a minute to invade Iraq because the US military, in fact, predicted that the invasion of Iraq could become another Vietnam. And that the Iraqis were not going to welcome Americans with open arms, as some members of the American government predicted. So they had to concoct a narrative of weapons of mass destruction, the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, produced by the United States' former ally, Saddam Hussein, during the Iran-Iraq War. And they did that. And the government and the media worked hand in hand to hoodwink the American people and convince them that there were weapons of mass destruction where there were none. Well, what ends up happening after the troops start going in is that the media corps in the United States invades the country alongside of the military. I don't know if you remember this new development that was celebrated at the time called embedded journalism, that American journalists literally were going to report from Iraq, from the military vehicles and headquarters of American empire in Iraq. If that isn't a wholesale co-signing of American military exploits, I don't know what is. I think that might have been the first time in US history that happened. So that's my example, but ultimately there is a relationship between US foreign policy and domestic policy. So precisely at the moment in the 1980s and 90s, when the United States is launching interventions through third parties in Latin America and the Middle East and elsewhere, because it's not able to do so frontally because of its defeat in the Vietnam War. This is the so-called Nixon doctrine, that we're going to carry out American interests abroad through third parties, of which Saddam Hussein is a part, by the way. While we're doing that and literally devastating people in Latin America, in places like Nicaragua and Guatemala, through third parties and the CIA. Here domestically, the media is focused exclusively on two major issues of concern to Americans, supposedly. The crisis of immigration, that immigrants are taking over the country and, crossing the border, and that, immigration is code word for Latinos and Mexicans in particular, and that the big problem in American society is crime. And that's code word, as you know, for Black people, especially in the post-civil rights and Black power movement eras. So this is also a period that sees the end of the American dream and deindustrialization spread throughout the country. So at a moment when we're destroying people's lives abroad, and when economically the American working class is losing ground, the scapegoats that the American media literally create are immigrants and Black people and crime. And that media emphasis fuels policies that destroy the lives of immigrants, but also Black people in the United States through the expansion of prisons on a mass scale. And the other part of the question was, what are examples of challenges to this? Alternative media, media that's not mainstream, WBAI, Truth Out, The Intercept, every mom and pop alternative press operation that exists in this country that offers a different perspective from that of the mainstream has to be supported. That's on the left. Because ultimately, if you don't have an alternative media, and our alternative media is rather weak, in the context of economic and political crisis, in a country where white supremacy reigns, a huge number of white folks are going to actually believe that the problem is the Mexicans and the Blacks, literally. And they're going to stop believing in history and science, which is going to pave the road to the likes of Trump. So radical media, of which this program is a part, is something that we have to defend, fund, and encourage and help institutionalize. But that project is connected to the project of rebuilding a left that's tied to organization independent of the 501c3 world.
Thank you so much, Johanna. The next question is for Nikai and Ola. One of the basic contradictions of US exceptionalism is the idea that the US is an empire of freedom, or that the US uses its military power to spread democracy and civilization, not for economic or political domination like other empires in world history. Why do you think referring to the US as an empire is still a no-go for social justice movements in the US and the West generally? Nakaya, do you want to go first?
Yes, I can go first. That's no problem. I would say that I would try to keep this question a bit short, but I would say that one problem or one reason as to why social movements, particularly what we are talking about here, right? Black, Indigenous, or people of color social movements, like why have these movements moved away from language of empires? Basically what the question is asking. Well, I think that I would give one international example, one more domestic, I guess. One international example would be the concept of liberalism, or what some people have called like the liberal diaspora, and basically the liberal diaspora. I'm trying to understand this through the relationship of human rights, right? And the rise of human rights, and how these, basically it's a question of funding at the end of the day, right? How are these like local nonprofits or local organizations either in Latin America, who are they receiving funding to, and how does this funding in these different ideas that come from the United States or maybe elsewhere from Europe, how do these affect the local relationships and the local social justice movements that are built in particular countries of Latin America, or et cetera, et cetera. So I think liberalism has a direct effect in the ways in which people tend to move away from the language of empire, right? Because I think that the language of empire forces us to talk about more radically about these forces at multiple different scales. And when you are challenged to question the institution or the state that's providing you funding, then it becomes complex, it becomes muddy. So I would give that's a more like a practical example of what I've seen across social movements and basically through the United States aid and other different kinds of funding, right? So in the other example, to keep it also short, is the question of, and this happens to me a lot because basically how I stumbled into working with Central American trans women, because I'm not Central American, is just kind of meeting them on the migrant route and just getting to know them, right? But what I witnessed while interacting with them is sort of like how people, perhaps from other parts of the world, perceived oppressed subjects within the empire, right? Native people, Black people, and many others who have been in the United States for quite a while. So I think that while in the left, there is a sort of solidarity between different kinds of groups. I think more generally, I think internationally, there's this understanding. For example, a lot of people often tell me, oh, I thought Native Americans were rich. And I think that's a very common conception across the world, where people think that Native Americans have money because of casinos, right? Because of media and the ways in which Native Americans have been portrayed, right? So I think for example, that's one example. Another example is sort of like I've seen that a lot of people who sometimes would criticize Black people from the United States, right? Saying certain things about them, and often using the word quote unquote lazy, or using these sort of stereotypes that are processed and sent all over the world. So I think that also sort of disrupts the ways in which we talk about empire, because there are subjects, as it was mentioned before, the United States is a settler colony. So there are subjects who are oppressed within the settler colony. And it is important that these connections continue to be merging between international people, so that they get to see Native American people, so that they get to see the descendants on enslaved people, and how we continue to be here resistant, right? Because like settler colonialism is a process, it's not an event. So they haven't not won. I think that's very important for us to think about this. They have not yet to win, because unless all natives are disappeared, we are still contesting them. We are still resistant. So this idea of colonialism being far gone is not, because right when, for example, during Trump's attempt to build a border wall, right, in Texas, the Native people of Texas, we were there, even though he violated many laws, we were there protesting, often with very little support from the Latino community, almost no support from the Latino community. And perhaps it has to do with the way in which Latinos tend to think about nation state or territory or space itself, right? We think of space as, okay, this is our homeland, and we're gonna fight for the humans and the non-humans, right? This idea that it's our territory. So I think I'm gonna end there as a way of sort of thinking that perhaps some of the reasons why border discourse hasn't arrived or hasn't come across is perhaps liberalism, is perhaps this lack of understanding of oppressed subjects within the settler colony at a larger scale, like at international scale. And I would say the third thing that is mostly focused on my context is the concept of border thinking, the idea of borders as being definite of one's identity, almost, right? Almost as for example, when I say the word US-Mexico border, right? Often people imagine violence, they imagine like immigration issues, right? Which is true, it happens, right? But I think that we have to start thinking about the border, not just as a place that is controlled by both the United States and Mexico, but as a place that continues to be contested, right? A place that we continue to contest this militarization, and we will continue to do so because there is no choice. This is our homeland, and we have no choice. This is what we have to do. I will stop there. Thank you very much.
That was a mic drop. So this question and the struggle around the lack of any kind of focus on the US empire or the US imperialistic apparatus as like the source of all the problems that, you know, folks in my community experience. Like this, I guess, myopic perspective that leaves out empire, the US empire, that leaves out any kind of like really global context in terms of social justice movements here is something that my organization, BLMP, has been grappling with since our existence. We do a lot of work. We're solidly within the immigrant rights or migrant justice movement, as well as LGBTQ, Black liberation. And in all of these movements, we are in the minority in terms of being able to link all the various campaigns, all the various experiences to the fact that we are living in the belly of the beast here. We are living in the source of the problem, but it's like the elephant in the room, we don't name it, right? And I feel like this happens for a number of reasons. I mean, I can speak from the perspective of the immigrant rights or migrant justice movement is one, we've talked about how anti-Black, right? This particular movement, it's not the only movement, of course, but this is one in which I'm immersed in. The invisibility, the marginalization, the exclusion of Black migrants, especially Black migrants who have various intersectional identities, queer and trans, Black migrants who are women, Black migrants who are sex workers, Black migrants who are living with disabilities, who are living with HIV, all of these communities that are my communities are usually left out, right? And for us who are on the margins of the margins, we are here as migrants because in Nigeria, I can't live in Nigeria. And the US is one of the reasons for that, right? Folks who are from Honduras, folks who are from Uganda, right? Queer and trans folks from Uganda who can't be in Uganda because a white American pastor went there and stirred things up. And now there's this jail the gays bill, right? Jail the gays law. So for us, being able to work with the movement to talk about why it's not enough to focus on immigration policy, even though I understand as someone who was formerly undocumented for many years, I understand the importance of fighting for legal status for folks. I understand that completely. However, that is the Band-Aid solution. And it doesn't work upstream from the problem. It just works in the situation where the problem already exists and you're just kind of like, putting Neosporin on it and moving on, right? So I think folks don't talk about the US empire because one, it would force us to understand the ways in which we're complicit in the empire building and empire maintaining this country does. We are all complicit in that. You have no choice but to be complicit. Just by waking up in the morning, breathing air, our existence actually predicates on the death and violence of folks in the global South, of Black and brown folks here, right? Who are, again, at the Black and brown folks, especially those at the margins of the margin, right? So I think we don't talk about the US empire as something that we need to tackle ultimately because we are complicit in the empire building, empire maintaining. That's one. Two, there is a certain kind of laziness that has come upon, and I hope this doesn't sound ableist in any way, but there's a certain kind of organizing and movement building laziness that has happened to us as various movements with the rise of the nonprofit industrial complex, right? We have new corporations called nonprofits, and we have, career building paths that folks are establishing. Social justice is a career. Like, what the hell? This just is not, what reality are we living in, right? You can't have radical upheaval of this empire when you are operating with the confines of the state. When you're operating with the tools the state is giving you to fight back, what the hell kind of fight back is that? It's not revolutionary. It's not going to unearth or upheave anything. It's just maintaining the empire building, and it's maintaining the empire, right? So our movements will ultimately have to reorient ourselves to a new North Star, right? We would ultimately have to really understand what risk-taking looks like, what transformative solidarity looks like, right? We would have to give up and sacrifice a lot. And our social justice movements are nowhere near that reckoning or understanding of that mandate. And I already talked about the nonprofit industrial complex, right? This is how we are fighting now. And each year, the state continues to talk about the various organizing tactics that we've used, put them under this vein of lobbying and be like, all right, you can't do these things, you can no longer do. Otherwise, your organization or your formation will be targeted. And then on the funding side, foundations are like, well, you can't organize in this way, and we will not give you money to organize in this way. So I just want to put all of that out into the ether for y'all. That's my kind of understanding of what's going on for, relative to this question and what my community is seeing in terms of the resistance to really focusing on the US empire and the US imperialism as what we really should be fighting, and reorienting ourselves to that.
Ola, you saw Nakaya's mic drop and you dropped a mic of your own. So super appreciating sort of what everyone has said, and you've shared so much. We still have like another question, but what we really want to do is, give some time to the attendees and the audiences to be able to ask and answer questions. And our team has been taking down some questions that have already been asked. So I'm going to pass the mic to Malcolm. Malcolm, if you're able to come on video to moderate the Q&A. And thank you so much to the panelists.
Yeah, thank you so much. I am really glad actually that I was off video and on mute so that I could clap and scream and shout as y'all were offering all these nuggets of wisdom. Just really, really appreciate the real hard talk, first of all, about the fact that we don't have a choice on whether we do this work. That comes through loud and clear. It's our home, whether our home is our homelands, whether it's our home is our communities, whether our home is the planet. In all those definitions of the word, you all have really illustrated the fact that this is an urgent concern, and some of the fact, and especially that there's just no time. There's just no time. I'm also appreciating the real concrete conversation that we're having about how violence gets normalized and how violence on behalf of states and on behalf of elite interests within states gets normalized. I'm here trying to weave together some of especially what Nakai and Dr. Hilal and Johanna, Dr. Fernandez are bringing as well. I just really, really appreciate that. The question is, are we going to continue to act as if siding with states is siding with people? That seems to be one of the fundamental questions that you all seem to be bringing here. So I'm just really, really deeply appreciative of all the complexity, all the story, all the knowledge. So, okay, now that I'm done gushing, we have questions. We have questions here for us. So the first question from the audience is, in addition to uplifting some of these alternative outlets that we have, how do we combat the narrative gaslighting? So in addition, I'm going to guess in addition to uplifting alternative media outlets in this case, what are some other ways that we as individual organizers, individual people can also combat some of this narrative gaslighting that you all have described? We can do this popcorn style. So I guess whoever would like to begin can go ahead and unmute, and we will.
I think, Dr. Fernandez already spoke to this in terms of just us creating our own outlets, right? And also being in control of our own narratives. At my organization, BLNP, we launched our own Medium page, and that's following in the tradition of other comrades and other formations that are doing that as well, in terms of not relying on mainstream media, but having their own kind of machine that generates narrative, right? It speaks to the core of our experiences and our vision and our dreams, right? So that's one thing. I would also add that mainstream media, we know, is pretty much another tentacle of the American empire. And so the main job of mainstream media is to be the propaganda machine and kind of like, churn out the narratives and the messages that the empire wants to maintain its control. So there's no way, in my mind, to destabilize American mainstream media without, again, tackling the beast of the US imperialistic apparatus. So that's my, my insights there.
So organize. I'm shocked. I love that. Yeah. Who else would like to chime in here?
I'll chime in. I think one of the things that I've tried to do is to work with Muslim writers in particular, and to help them develop stories, articles, op-eds, etc., that actually challenge institutionalized Islamophobia and call out what is missing in the narratives that are being told. And, one of the examples I keep thinking of is I wrote an op-ed earlier this year, and it was about a former Guantanamo Bay prisoner who was from Tunisia, was resettled in Kazakhstan, had heart problems, and was unable to get the care he needed in Kazakhstan. Then had to beg and plead to be resettled in Tunisia. They never let him. The US government would not let him return. He ended up in Mauritania, where the healthcare system was also inadequate, and then he died. So the point of the story is, if you just looked at the New York Times docket on Guantanamo prisoners, you would have just seen that he died of heart disease, right? But he didn't just die of heart disease, right? He died specifically because the United States government neglected him, abandoned him, treated him like a terrorist even after he'd been released for nothing. And so part of the work that really needs to be done is, it seems so simple, right? But it's about telling the truth and providing the context. How do you understand what the story is actually about if you're still stuck in or entrenched in the mainstream media's narrative of how things happen? And there's so many other, stories and narratives about, the ways that the United States has intervened in other countries. And for example, as Dr. Fernandez and Ola brought up about immigration, right? What is the story about immigration? The United States is so generous. Look at us, we're accepting, 50 immigrants today, right? And, we had nothing to do with their forced displacement or anything. So what is the truth of that, right? And so part of it is getting these ideas placed into our alternative media platforms. But the other part is getting people, our allies, marginalized communities, to really understand, right? How do we actually challenge these narratives, right? What are the missing parts of the story? Why is the story being told the way it is? And who does that benefit? And I think the last thing I'll say is, just because I do a lot of work around narratives in particular, what I've observed, for example, in a lot of Muslim spaces is the dominant narrative is always, right, Muslims are terrorists. And oftentimes how the Muslim community responds in what they think is a counter narrative is to say that, no, we're not. That's not a counter narrative, right? That is a narrative that accepts the premises and assumptions on which the dominant narrative is based, and then just uses that to reject the dominant narrative, right? As opposed to a narrative that outright rejects that premise. So we need to outright reject the premise of how the United States frames immigration, right? How it frames its warfare, militarism, surveillance, the list goes on and on and on, rather than, again, accepting the assumptions of the dominant narrative. And when we do accept the assumptions of the dominant narrative, we make absolutely no progress whatsoever, because we're still then legitimizing the dominant narrative.
I think that's such an important point. I think one thing I would even add there is, as a Muslim myself, right, is that one of the byproducts of that, I think also in racially, for what the race of Muslims became and what the shape of Muslim as a racial identity took, is that it actually caused people to also take a stance and distance themselves from the idea of political Islam, which just so happened to be the same stance that the FBI had taken in the counterintelligence program against Black Muslims based in the United States, like Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad and others, right? And so there's this weird kind of coming together of disavowal and erasure of politically engaged leftist Black Muslims and of Black identity from Islam generally. That's also part of, right, that kind of. So I really appreciate you bringing that. Dr. Fernandez, it looks like you're about to jump in here.
Well, this is a complex question. How do we shift the narrative beyond supporting alternative press? I think that we saw this in the explosion of protests we saw in 2020 around the killing of so many people. So today we're talking about the problem of the police, and we're talking about abolition. What that tells us is that social movements, protest, they shift the terms of debate. They force the issue in the public square that has experienced blackout by the mainstream media. So this is a way to teach mass numbers of people beyond your small group. So as we are organizing and engaging in protest activity to come, we have to understand that historically movements change and deconstruct ideology. But that doesn't happen automatically. We actually have to go in as leaders, collectively, right? Thinking about the arguments we're going to put out there and how we are going to connect the issue of the police domestically with its expansion in the world, right? Because the police in New York are very friendly with the Israeli police. In fact, they train each other. And in fact, the United States, when it invades another country, the first thing it does is that it trains the police of the country it's invading to repress dissent. So we need to think ahead. We need to actually become internationalists and see international solidarity as our first line of defense. When we are organizing, how can we make these connections and push the ball forward? But we ourselves have to engage in a process of deep political education. Capitalism is inherently expansionistic. Why? Because through expansion, capitalism overcomes its cyclical crises of overproduction. There's always a recession every 7 or 8 years. And, mainstream ruling class economists see this, and capitalism overcomes these economic crises through expansion. Expansion essentially means imperialism. So the North American Free Trade Agreement was an attempt on the part of American capital during a series of recessions in the 80s and 90s to crowbar into the Latin American and Mexican economy, open that economy up to American business. And that's what led to this mass migration of Mexicans, because Mexican farmers could no longer subsist. They couldn't compete with large American agribusiness. So there's always a connection between domestic and foreign policy. And we need to expose that. But that requires a deep understanding of the structural and economic roots of local problems. So reading, education, reading groups in your political education can't be something we do when we have time. It has to be integral to our organizing work.
A refrain that I will put above my bed and repeat often has to be integral to our organizing time. Yes, political education is constantly identified as something that is needed or is identified historically as something that led to a deficiency in movements that we think of as not having succeeded, and yet we make so little time for it today, collectively. So thank you for bringing that. So we're going to move to one more question, and then we are going to wrap. Thank you so much for your time. The question here is, what do you see as the opportunities and the necessary steps then in using language and stories that make empire and imperialism explicit? So I know that you all have hit on this quite a bit already. I'm just trying to reiterate and underline some of this for folks at home. So what do you see as some of the, yes, what do you see as some of the opportunities and necessary steps here? What do you see as what needs to be done in order to make US empire and imperialism explicit and undermine some of the frames that you all have identified?
Should I go? Yes, all right. So, I mean, I'm not sure I have an answer for it, but I think I'm just gonna talk about some of the things that we've been doing, just sort of organizing, because I think our organizing is actually some of the comments that were made by Dr. Fernandez and many others. I think like this idea of internationalism and making connections and sort of understanding that what's happening internally within the empire is affecting what's happening outside of the empire, because it's the same kind of, I think that that's very important. For example, we have, through my work, we have, first started as a way of helping trans queer people that are mostly Hondurans in its vast majority, many of them Black and indigenous Hondurans, is to sort of help them move from point A to point B by using my citizenship as kind of my most given privilege, my Mexican citizenship, because this at time was in Mexico. So our initial organizing was to just kind of move people from point A to point B, helping them cross this checkpoint infrastructure, helping them figure out a way to cross these places without being not just repressed by the state. We haven't talked about criminal groups, which are also very important in the ways in which we understand empire as well. Maybe as a resistance, maybe as possibilities for death as well. So we started accompanying a lot of chicas, trans women in its vast majority, but there were other LGBT people there. And as we started sort of getting to know the space and getting to know how it functioned, how the states responded, how Mexico responded, how US citizens responded, we started shifting our organizing to be much more broader, much more international. So at some point, when there were people detained in the United States, we would be in conversation with trans women in Honduras that were about to leave, right? So we had a much more broader understanding of space and what it actually meant. We also had a mechanism to support people that were deported. So during the 2018 Central American exodus, I accompanied the 200 and so plus LGBT people. They were not the only LGBT people that were traveling on that mass exodus of Central Americans, but that's the people that I accompanied. About half of them made it into the United States. About half of them did not make it for different reasons. And the main reason being deportation. Right, so what we sort of created is sort of challenge this idea and help people once they're deported. So we set aside some funding to help them once they were deported, because we knew that many people were going to be deported. So we started organizing that way, thinking about all the different possibilities that could emerge in space that could make people more in danger or could oppress them further. So yeah, and one last I think example that we did as well was sort of challenge U.S. attorneys who continue to operate on this idea of imperialism, and is to sort of challenge them before we started doing these sort of LGBT caravans, a lot of attorneys wouldn't file for parole requests before people presented to seek asylum. So what that meant is that a lot of attorneys would pretty much normalize detention center. They would say, oh, once they're in detention center, they can contact me and I can support them with legal aid, which defeats the point, because what we want is to avoid detention, is to tell the US government to release people under their own recognizance or on the basis of parole. And the attorneys did not want to. Nonprofit attorneys, I'm not gonna say names, they were opposed to this idea, right? Because you had to cross the border, you have to function differently, because we were in Mexico, we were in the United States. But after many, the chicas convinced them and they were forced to apply for parole requests. And the parole requests were actually quite successful. All of the trans women were released on paroles, where if we weren't filed the parole requests, that wouldn't have happened. So I think these are sort of some of the solidarities that they don't mean liberation, they perhaps don't mean revolution, but these are some of the things that we are just been doing to fight back against the empire. So I would just keep it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Survival pending revolution is what that sounds like. Absolutely. I think we have time to hear from one more panelist here.
Very quickly, maybe we can hear from two. Military production and military destruction, US military production and US military destruction of lands around the world is the biggest driver of climate destruction and climate change. So empire is destroying and hurrying the destruction of our environment. That's a story that we need to amplify and that people need to understand and know.
Can I jump in real quick?
Please, yeah, that was a note
Although-
clearly for any journalists out there. Any journalists out there, Dr. Fernandez has given you your
Yes.
your orders.
Talking points, yes. And also, were you finished? I didn't want to cut you, interrupt you. Yeah, okay. So I just want to quickly bring into the room our for BLMP, our communications folks, Karemi and Jade, because I had to get some insights from them as well for this question in particular. And, you know, just quite simply, you know, in terms of this question is, you know, just being explicit, right? Don't dance around the truth. Call the US and other Western empires for what they are. Say the word, say abolition, say abolish ICE, say abolish the police, and mean it. You know, say the term US imperialism, right? And think beyond the borders of the US, right? Many larger platformed organizations and media publications, they still shy away from naming the US as empire, right? So it's like state, I think it was Johanna who said, confront the bully with the reality, right? So state that there's a genocidal colonial legacies at work here. Like say those terms, right? And don't shy away from them. So I will stop there.
And
Please.
okay, so I'll quickly add, something that has really bothered me, and I know that people don't always make a distinction between messaging and narrative. But when I think about messaging, in particular from the left and progressive worlds, to me, it always means how do we make our message more palatable to mostly white people who need to hear the message in a certain way to believe that there's actually a problem. And I think we need to abandon that. I think we need to talk about narrative. What is the truth of the story? So when the Muslim ban came out, for example, right, very typical narrative, this is not who we are. The United States is a land of immigrants, et cetera, et cetera. And that doesn't get us anywhere, right? So I think it's about looking at the long-term goal. The long-term goal is to dismantle and abolish US empire. And if we want to actually get there, we're not going to get there if we continue to tell the falsehoods, because we're trying to convince people who may not be with us in the struggle to liberation anyway.
Thank you so much, Maha. And we will close with this question. Thank you again to Ola, to Johanna, to Nakai, to Maha for making time for this conversation. We weren't able to get to all the questions, but I hope that this got people's creative and organizing juices flowing. If attendees, both on Facebook and on Zoom, if you can please give your feedback in the survey that's been dropped in the chat. We would love to continue this question further and continue developing this project further. Thank you again so very much to all of you, and Malcolm, and Claire, and Suzanne, and the closed captioner. Have a lovely rest of your day, everyone.